Thank you everyone for joining us today on the Higher Density Housing Lunchtime event. It's hosted by the Urban Design Group. Obviously, it's a very popular theme given the numbers in attendance. I'm Scott Adams. I'm an Urban Design Group member and Director of Urban Design at BPTW. I'll be chairing today's session. This is the final of a series of events on housing, but there'll be more soon, so definitely have a look out at the Urban Design Group website, as well as our newsletter in the Urban Design Journal, but do become a member if you aren't already. Previous sessions can be found on the Urban House YouTube channel, so it's well worth a look. I'd ask everyone to mute their microphones. However, do feel free to leave your cameras on. The session will be recorded, so if your camera is on, you might make the final edit, just to warn you in advance. Throughout the session, we have a few polls. I'll ask Robert to put up the first poll, just to get an understanding of people's experience with deck access. Just leave this open for about 30 seconds. Just comment whether you live in a deck access, you have lived, or you've never lived in a deck access flat. Most people haven't. A few people have in the past, and about 3% currently live in a deck access flat. Great, very good to know. Yeah, a few more have lived. That's great. Okay, well, I'm very pleased to have Andrew Beharrell here of Pollard Thomas Edwards. He's joining us. He's a former senior partner at the practice and currently advisor to the studio. He also currently focuses on design review, writing, and research. He's recently written a very timely book with Rory Olcado, who may be joining us shortly. Hopefully he does. The book is called The Deck Access Housing Design Guide, A Return to Streets in the Sky. Deck access housing, it's one of those things that you love it or hate it. I assume most people in the audience probably have a preference for it. So it'd be really good to hear more during the question time at the end of the session. But as you can imagine, Andrew is quite keen. He says, a good deck is a delight, a new way of walking through the city, a convivial and neighborly space, a sort of second balcony shared with your neighbors. In his book, he introduces the history of deck access. He talks about UK-based case studies, as well as those further afield, and as a practical guide towards the end of the book. We'll be looking forward to him discussing it a bit further, as well as the merits of other higher density typologies as well. Just before we do, I'll ask Robert to put up the. And for those who are involved in design, it'd be great if you could input your views on this. Have you experienced resistance to developing deck access homes for market sale or rent? So definitely a stronger tilt towards resistance than enthusiasm. And quite a bit neutral as well. Great, thank you very much. Well, I'll hand it over to you, Andrew, and we're very much looking forward to the session.
Okay. Thanks very much. Thank you to the Urban Design Group for inviting me to talk to you today. And it's great to see so many people on the call, which suggests that there is an interest in this topic. I get blank looks when I mention the subject of this book to people who are not in the industry or non-professionals. But it's between us within the industry, it's certainly subject to some controversy. Just to get the first thing out of the way, in case anybody doesn't understand what we're talking about, what we mean by deck access, what we mean is apartment blocks or blocks of flats, which are arranged so that each flat has a front door accessed from an external walkway rather than from an internal lobby or a corridor. And the other confusion to get out of the way is there are lots of competing names for this typology. I've mentioned walkway. A lot of people talk about gallery access, balcony access, which was popular among the Victorians. From some of my more rarefied architect colleagues, I've even heard ambulatory and loggia. And of course, we talk about streets in the sky, and that comes with a whole lot of cultural baggage that I'll be talking about. All of these terms are effectively interchangeable. I'm going to suggest a different way of analysing different types of deck a bit later on in this talk. But we chose the word deck access for two main reasons, really. One is it's the word that the GLA uses, and one of the main reasons, as you'll hear, for the growth in deck access housing is its effective promotion through the Mayor's London Housing Design Guide, which most of you will know became incorporated in the London Plan through the London Housing SPG. So why do we choose the word deck? First was that reason, the GLA. The second was more personal, which is I've always really liked the nautical connotations of deck access, perhaps because I have parents who are both in the Navy. And of course, we'll be talking about those origins in relation to Le Corbusier in particular in a moment. Next bit of introduction. Why did we write this book? Well, firstly, we saw a gap in the market. There's no existing comprehensive book about this typology that we're aware of, that we could find, or at least not in the English language, and I don't think in any other. Secondly, as Scott's mentioned, there's lots more new deck access housing around, and we had no difficulty finding some 35 or more case studies to feature in the book. We had to turn a lot away. I'll be saying more about why there's more of it about, but it's got a lot to do with regulatory push for dual aspect homes. Plus, I think, a generational shift in the perception of deck access housing. And I'm especially interested in the first thing, the way that major changes in housing design can be triggered by seemingly modest regulatory shift. Another reason we wrote the book is that it's hard to do this stuff properly, to get it right. There are lots of tricky rules and lots of design challenges, but it does provide or can provide great homes and places if it's done well. And the best of it is winning lots of awards, and most importantly, it's popular with residents. And to be controversial, it could become, I think it may become, the default solution for high-density, mid-rise housing, particularly in London, but also elsewhere in other UK cities. And that's partly for perhaps a negative reason, which is all the other ways of doing housing, all the other typologies, and I'll say a bit more about this, are getting even harder to do because of regulation. And the final reason, which I've already alluded to, was that in the UK, in the UK, not on the continent, deck access carries a lot of really interesting reputational baggage or even stigma. And the best way I find of explaining what I mean by deck access to my friends who are not architects or in the construction industry is to think of pretty much any TV crime drama, British TV crime drama, will feature armed police smashing in the front door of a drug dealer's den or a terrorist's cell, which will absolutely inevitably be in a deck access housing estate. This doesn't do anything very good for the reputation of the typology. But I've realized, of course, there's a very simple reason why it always features in these programs. Think Line of Duty, for example. And that's because you don't get great camera shots in a corridor or a lift lobby. Deck access is much more scenographic. You can pan out and pan in. It lends itself to drama. Next, what's in this book? We have a foreword by Owen Hafferley, who himself lives in a deck access flat. We have an analysis of the current issues around deck access housing and housing generally. We have a short history of deck access housing in Britain from the 1850s onwards, plus a decade-by-decade survey from 1900 to 2000. We have 17 UK case studies and 15 European ones. And then we have a detailed practical guide covering all the regulatory, technical, and cost issues around deck access in the UK. So there's quite a lot in there. I'm going to touch very lightly on bits of that, most of it, in this talk. I'll see how the time goes, and if I need to, because it's very important we leave time for questions and comment afterwards, especially with so many of you attending. But before I really get on to what's in the book, I'd like to kind of lead into the subject with, I'd like to kind of ease into this with a bit more sort of personal stuff about what I call my kind of deck access journey through 40 years in the business. But it starts kind of the beginning and the end of this journey, well, hopefully not the end, this point of the midpoint of the journey. When I was a student in the late 70s, early 80s, we were taught to admire full-on British modernism. My professor was Colin St. John Wilson. Leslie Martin had recently retired, but was still around in the department in Cambridge. So places like Park Hill were, which I'll say more, were held up to us as icons and examples of how to do it. So I was absolutely thrilled when the publication date of our book, which was the end of February this year, coincided with the opening at the National Theatre of a musical about deck access housing called Standing at the Sky's Edge. I hope lots of you might have been to see it. It was great entertainment. And if you didn't see it, you might have seen the posters up around the Tube in London. It was a sellout show, and the star of the show was an enormous recreation of a section of Park Hill, the decks playing host to a cast of about 40 people singing and dancing and an orchestra. At least it appears that if no one else does, theatre audiences love deck access. But going back a bit further to the early to mid 90s, the early part of my career was spent in part demolishing deck access housing estates that were regarded as failed places. Now, it's a question for another day as to whether we would do that now with our new emphasis on carbon and retrofit, but also a much stronger political and community move towards keeping estates. But nevertheless, that was what was happening at this time. This example is Lefevre Walk in Bow. These impressive but rather grim deck access brutalist blocks, which are no longer there, replaced by the very friendly bricky stuff that we designed. You can see on the right, designed, I should say, with the participation of the residents, including Margaret here on the left. But whilst what we shouldn't do is to romanticize what these estates were like, there were genuine and considerable and intractable physical and social problems with them. In this case, antisocial behavior. These decks were all linked up. They weren't properly secured, and they weren't well overlooked. One of the popular designs of that period was maisonettes, which made great homes, but often what they had on the deck was just a front door, maybe the high-level window to a bathroom. There were no habitable spaces overlooking the decks. And there were technical problems of water ingress and noise, much of it exacerbated by inadequate management. But a strange thing happened at the end of the 90s, which is we started building deck access schemes again, despite their this very negative experience of the post-war estates. And again, this was to do with regulatory, some of the kind of unintended consequences of, in this case, planning regulation, which was something called live work. You may have heard of it. And for a brief moment, live work was supported, or at least reluctantly allowed, particularly in Tower Hamlets and Hackney, as a means of getting around the problem of what to do with redundant or underused industrial land. So the jobs were going, the businesses were going, not necessarily disappearing, but moving to more suitable, better connected places around the M25. Lots of land, particularly land in Fish Island, where this scheme is, in Tower Hamlets, now, of course, wonderfully transformed by the post-Olympic legacy. But the architectural response to doing live work, which was were to be regulated, I'm going to say units, because they were, well, not just for living, which would genuinely suit people who carried on a business at home. And one of the requirements was goods access. Every home should have goods access. So the logic and the commerciality of providing goods lifts and goods access, plus the established typology of walkways as an industrial form, led to a whole new brief generation of live work schemes with deck access. And what in fact happened was most of these became live without the work. It was impossible to really monitor and enforce the original planning designation, and they were eventually allowed to convert their use class to regular residential. But what they've left is a legacy of very large apartments. And of course, now lots of people work from them again as a result of the pandemic and growth in working from home. But I think in terms of their imagery and their references of loft living in converted industrial buildings, some of these were conversions, they weren't all new built. They were very appealing to a new generation that didn't have that association of deck access with problem council estates. I'd love to say we designed this. We didn't, of course. Cartwright Pickard did, and they did a great job. Very similar period, around late 90s, 2000. And what this one shows very early is something that architects today are keenly interested in, which is the suitability of deck access to modular housing construction. So the combination of a regular grid of apartments and a separately attached form of circulation is very, very suitable to forms of prefabrication. And here we have Peabody doing that very early and doing it very well. So more up to date. So my practice is now doing a lot of deck access housing. Here's one fairly recent example, actually in Bow again, by coincidence. And you can see in the right-hand photograph on the left of that, it attaches, it's inserted into an old LCC deck access estate. But that wasn't the only reason we chose it. The configuration worked well with the particular constraints of the site. But we're also really interested here to explore the sort of multifunctional nature of the deck, that it's not only a means of access, but it provides a threshold to the home, provides a social space, and it does useful things in terms of environmental performance. And here we come to the nub of the whole dual aspect thing. Homes which have outlook in two directions, consequently the scope for natural cross-ventilation, with the decks themselves and or balconies providing a degree of solar shading, which has become and is becoming a much bigger thing in the UK, as recognised by the introduction of Part O, overheating in the building regulations, last year, I think, was it about 18 months ago. And then the final scheme in my personal journey was this one, again in Hackney Wick. It's all happening there. The interesting thing about this is, whilst the previous schemes are mainly social housing, this is deck access for private sale. And the sales agent, Savills, said that to us, it was the best-selling apartment scheme in London at the time. So deck access was not in any way an obstacle to people buying homes here and buying into that kind of loft living imagery. In fact, 3 of the estate agents from the local office bought flats here. Strangely, elsewhere in London, I'm not going to say where or for whom, we designed a deck access scheme for clients, to which their property advisor, a different firm of major UK property specialists, said, tell your architect to tear it up and start again. Buyers don't want deck access and lenders won't touch it. So I cannot square these two things, these two experiences, except to say that I think that public perception of deck access is outstripping the sometimes rather dated attitudes of developers, excuse me, and their advisors. Right, next, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the type. I'm going to go through this pretty briskly because I'm conscious of time. My co-author, Rory, would have been doing this part. He was the prime mover behind our history chapter in our book, but he realised belatedly that he had to participate in a rather bizarre ritual that we have at Pollard Thomas Edwards, which is that every Thursday someone has to cook lunch for the whole practice of, I think, about 90 people at the moment. And this is a very stressful activity. And of course, he realised his number was up today. So that's what he's been doing. He may join us, and I hope if he does that he will chip in. So there's much more of this in the book, but just to a kind of whistle-stop tour. So on the right, you've got something called The Nemesis of Neglect, which is a cartoon by Tenniel from Punch magazine in 1888 about London's slums and about disease. And at that time, slum landlords were presiding over, in quote, interminable square miles of wretched shacks, usually of brick with tile or slate roofs. And they were called rookeries. And one of the worst, called Old Nicol, was replaced by the Boundary Estate, which many of you will know, a splendid example of early LCC work, actually not deck access in this case, but a suitable moment to introduce the LCC because it's the LCC which would make deck access homes central to its vision for 20th century housing in the capital. And you saw a little bit of that in the Joel's House example I showed you just now. There were lots of housing acts around from the 1850s onwards, addressing the housing and welfare of the working classes, not just in London, also in Liverpool and Manchester. The scheme bottom left is a wonderful example, Victoria Square in Manchester, photographed today. Go and see it if you don't know it. Very effective updating of deck access housing on very big scale, complete urban block. And on the right, you can see Tron Square in Edinburgh, 4-storey tenement that was upgraded by Patrick and Anna Geddes, I think in the 1889, it says in the caption. Again, top left, you've got J.J. Burnett's housing for the Glasgow Workmen's Welling Company on Rotten Row in 1892. And then this is the Bourne estate. That's going to come up later as one of our modern case studies, but here's the original Bourne estate. Again, most of you will know it if you're in London, and very easy and a great pleasure to visit. One of the most celebrated deck access schemes from the early 20th century. And on the right, you've got another of those, Swan Lake Estate in Rotherhithe, this beautiful construction drawing of it. But for all the innovation that was going on in the UK, there was something much bigger happening in Europe, and specifically in Italy, futurism, inspired by what today we call telecoms, inspired by skyscrapers, aircraft, and all kinds of the machine age. You can see on the right the futurist architecture of Antonio Santalia, who wrote the Futurist Manifesto in 1914 with Marinetti. And in the middle, the Lingotto car factory, the poster scheme really of futurist architecture, racetrack on the roof. And on the left, Fritz Lang sensing the futurist impulse too. And here we see his set builders making the elevated walkways on the city featured in Metropolis. And in a very different way, the Dutch were doing it too, very differently, being in their own way. And the Dutch have a very long tradition of deck access housing, which goes back at least as long as our own. This is called Spangen, forgive my pronunciation, groundbreaking social housing scheme completed in 1922, in which first floor maisonettes are accessed from a wide concrete deck, the first of its kind in the world, it is claimed. And the photo, I think, on the left really says it all, a proper place built for people, including children. And this is an example going forward into the 1930s of what some has called English modern. Much of it featured in Alan Power's wonderful book of that period. So this is modernism before World War II, stylish, but maybe not entirely modern in the continental sense, although much of it was built by emigres, architects from the continent. Importantly, on the right, most of you will know Isaac-on the Lawn Road Flats by Wells Coast. Now, this, interestingly, although a lot of what we've been speaking about the early period was deck access housing for the poor, this is deck access housing for the artistic middle classes. And it was that kind of housing for that kind of social group that was satirized by Heath Robinson in his wonderful book, How to Live in a Flat. Now, once you've spent your book budget buying our book, which I hope you will, if you don't own this one, How to Live in a Flat, rush out and get it. There's a lovely, currently available facsimile of it, which you can see the cover of here. So the destruction by aerial bombing in the war would effectively clear the way to the hugely ambitious post-war reconstruction plans across the whole of Britain, particularly in major cities. And deck access housing was a major feature of much of that post-war reconstruction work, of which Park Hill is the grandfather, really, of modern British deck access housing, 1957 onwards, Jack Lynn and Ivor Smith for Sheffield City. And modernism exploded into post-war Britain. The whole country took to it. And this was a startling change. And here are just three well-known examples, including work by Colin St. John Wilson, who I mentioned earlier, And also the plan there, you can see of Lasdun's Keeling House. And on the left, of course, Roehampton, still one of the best of its period. Now, as ever, in any story about modernism, housing, and the 20th century, we have to mention Le Corbusier, a great PR king and also a great architect. The Unité d'Habitation, which was a private cooperative project in Marseille, completed in 1952, was visited by pretty much every council in the UK. It's the ultimate housing exemplar. And Park Hill effectively externalized the central rue intérieure of the Unité, which Unité was not an external deck access scheme. And Park Hill did that to make a genuine urban place that aimed to the street life which its slum clearance residents were leaving behind. The wide decks of Park Hill had much in common with those proposed by the Smithsons in their competition entry for Golden Lane. And many of you will know the famous perspective drawing here, top left, which features Marilyn Monroe. And you'll see immediately the parallel between that and the illustration bottom left from Le Corbusier's Vers une Architecture, published in 1923, where he raves enthusiastically about the ocean liner, in this case specifically the promenade deck of the RMS Aquitania. And this is from Colin Buchanan's very influential 1963 government report, Traffic in Towns, which was reprinted as a Penguin paperback. So hugely important in shaping Britain's towns and cities in the post-war period by advocating the separation of people and cars. And the illustrator Kenneth Brown here gave form to the book's most extreme case study, reimagining London's Fitzrovia as a layer cake of walkways and decks with a dizzying armature of multi-lane motorways and service roads. And for a while, this new townscape vision actually worked. Buildings were looked after, people had jobs, rent was cheap, and it produced some of the finest examples, if also the most controversial, of public modernism in the UK. And I don't have time to talk about each of these, but many of you will be able to identify the images here. If you can't, you have to buy the book. And here's the sort of softer side of the modernist journey, more people-centric kind of architecture, Liddington Gardens by Darwin and Dark in Pimlico, and Erskine's Byker Wall in Newcastle. But in Britain, the mood changed in the late 70s and into the 80s. Financial markets, the energy markets, the Cold War, all inspired a shift away from collectivism in the UK, and deck access housing was becoming linked with urban deprivation. But I'm going to conclude the history bit, one more image after this, with this recent photograph from Dawson Heights, which was Kate McIntosh's extraordinary deck access scheme, revisited recently. I think it shows you not only the amazing views, but perhaps that maintenance really matters, and housing that's cared for does last. But I think the last slot in this session goes to Park Hill again, because it sparked a new wave of deck access housing. It was retrofitted by Urban Splash and a host of distinguished architects. And perhaps this has helped to inspire the industry to believe that this housing type was okay once again. So moving on, little bit about some typologies, putting deck access in the context of others. So we tend to think of different forms of residential apartment blocks in this way. Deck access, obviously what we're primarily talking about today. Corridor access speaks for itself and is central corridor, single aspect homes either side, is officially verboten by the GLA, and yet there's still quite a lot of it happening. For some reason, it seems to be acceptable for build to rent, but not for other forms of housing. I don't really understand that, why it should be acceptable for one and not the other, especially when we're trying to promote build to rent as a long-term form of housing, not just temporary housing. Villa blocks, by that we mean blocks standing in space with windows all around. And mansion blocks, my personal favorite, and some of you have heard me talk about mansion blocks at other events, traditionally having paired flats off a central staircase, so every flat went from front to back, so exactly as modern dual aspect does. Virtually impossible to do today economically because of the requirement for universal lift access. And therefore, we tend to do a lot of buildings which are kind of amalgam of villa and mansion blocks with maybe 4 to 6 flats per floor. And of course, towers, which are now a predominant or a dominant housing form in London and prominent in other cities such as Manchester, and the subject for a different talk on a different day, I think. Types of deck access. So getting away from those rather confusing words, balcony, gallery, deck, ambulatory. For the purpose of our case studies, we've broken these down as you see here. The most simple form is a projecting cantilevered deck. A more complex form, popular with particularly London architects and the new London vernacular, is a recessed deck, a deck that's held back behind often a brick, not always, but often a brick facade with effectively 2 wall planes. Supported deck is where you have projecting decks that have nevertheless are not cantilevered, but have a support structure of concrete or steel columns, sometimes clad in brick. Stepped decks, popular form in the post-war period, but also some really interesting new examples in our case studies. And then on the bottom row, you've got some more specialist kind of subcategories. The atrium type, where 2 parallel blocks are brought very close together with a narrow courtyard, usually, but not always, with a roof over it. Screened decks that are semi-enclosed, and then some decks that are fully enclosed with glazing, which trigger a whole different set of technical challenges. What are the benefits? I have to reach for the book here to just summarize, and then we'll talk about some of the challenges. So the benefits of deck access, some obvious, some less so, that you get homes, often every home in a scheme, having its own front door to, quote, the street and the sky, with an enhanced sense of personal identity that comes with that, and often a threshold and front door area which lends itself to visible personalization through personal belongings and planting and so on. Decks offer potential as social spaces for meeting neighbours. They offer scope for innovative open plan apartment layouts, maximising the effective use of space. Dual aspect homes offer cross ventilation, daylight from both sides, and a variety of outlook. Decks minimise internal common spaces with a potential reduction in cost, particularly management costs and the energy of heating and lighting such spaces. And by bringing all or most of the common areas into the open air, they have potential health benefits. What are the challenges? there are many. Noise nuisance generated by neighbours passing on the deck, particularly if there are a lot of neighbours passing. Poor design or poor construction can also lead to direct noise transfer through the structure. If large balconies are also provided, which are required, of course, in London, then there's a risk of too much shading, too much overshadowing, and difficulties achieving decent levels of daylight, even though you're getting it from two directions. You need careful detailed design to manage exposure to wind and rain, and this is one reason that we don't really recommend deck access for more than mid-rise. And to me, mid-rise is the sweet spot, 7 stories, but you might go to 9. There are obviously quite a few deck access schemes around, so 9 to 10 stories, but it can get pretty windy up there, not to mention the possible problems of vertigo and of antisocial behaviour, people chucking things off decks. Fire safety imposes a complex set of limitations on the length and detailing of decks and the homes they served, although open-air decks are inherently safer than enclosed common parts. Refuse management is another limitation on the length of decks. I've mentioned noise nuisance, but there's also visual privacy, of course, from people passing. And therefore, we tend not to recommend the deck side as suitable for the principal bedroom or the principal outlet from living rooms. But there are some successful exceptions to that. So these are just some of the challenges, alongside some really kind of quite intricate technical things about how you route pipes and wires and drainage and so on, all of which are covered in detail in our practical guide. Now, what I was going to do, I'm going to do very quickly, because I've been talking for longer than I'd planned. I hope the history was interesting, but it took a little time to get through that. Our book, as I say, about 35 case studies, a few more in the UK than in Europe. I was going to show you just a very few of those. But typically what you get for each of them, the UK case studies, 2 double spreads with basic description, data, photographs on the first spread. And on the second spread, you get location and then typical and ground floor plans and sections. As I said, because of time, I'm just going to whiz through these rather than dwell on them, because I want... Scott, are we going to... Is it 1:15 we're going to? Is that right?
I think the session's till 1, but I mean, if we go up to 1 now, and then...
Yeah, I think I need to speed up, so I'll do that. So I just selected a few of these to show you, give you a bit of the range and character. The Bourne estate I've mentioned as a historic precedent, but here we see the really splendid new insertions made to that by Matthew Lloyd Architects, which are beautifully detailed and wonderful sense of materiality. One thing that struck me about them, that may have changed now, you see how empty the decks were in the photographs, and they were very empty when I went there. Contrast that with the decks from the old housing that this is integrated with, which are packed full of plants and have been completely taken over as people's personal space. And I wonder whether the reason for that difference is the new housing is being more rigorously policed. And of course, we're now in an era where we're much more conscious of fire safety than we were. So that's one of the classic dilemma of how to design and use the deck, and how you keep a clear means of escape whilst allowing space for personalisation and planting. This is one of our own schemes, Colby Lodge, which is what we call third age housing for older people. And interestingly, I think 4 of the UK case studies, quite a high proportion, are older people's housing. And here the deck is very much a social space. The decks are very wide. They have kitchen dining rooms looking onto them. There's a sort of feature staircase, as well as the kind of utilitarian stair and lift core. And they've been found to work extraordinarily well in periods of very high, in heat waves. The shade on the deck has been very popular. Another remarkable third age housing scheme on the south coast by RCK, where again the deck is a social space, in this case enclosed, so they become like shared conservatory living rooms that can be opened up, and they have this rather wonderful latticed feature staircase. I do wonder now about the compliance of the scheme with modern current regulations. It does some quite challenging things, but the effect is very successful. A retrofit scheme, HMM. So in the section you can see restored historic building on the left, new block on the right, very narrow courtyard, atrium, in this case not covered, and the deck, instead of being attached to one side or the other, becomes a central feature with bridges. You can see that very clearly in this plan, which is a really nice way, both as of animating the space, but also pulling the deck away to give people more privacy, which they need because there are bedrooms in this case looking into that narrow atrium. And another retrofit, Bell Street Stables in Glasgow, which I think shows how attaching decks to a historic building, often particularly industrial buildings, can be a really clean and delightful way of providing the access required for a new use, in this case, housing. There's the plan. And I think our final, just for today, UK example, something very, very different aesthetically. The only UK scheme that really thinks it's on the continent, House for Artists, which also exploits that feature of the regularity of decks, which deck access housing, which I refer to in relation to modular building. It exploits that to show different ways in which the interior of homes could be, and indeed homes and workspaces, because these are artist studios as well, could be adapted over time to serve different kinds of community and different kinds of use, ways of using. Excuse me. Now, the headline I wanted to leave you with on these case studies is that the UK stuff is, for the most part, they're quite small schemes. They're very crafted. They're very careful. They're very polite. They're very people orientated, and they are excellent. But they're quite tame compared to what has been happening as a kind of continuous, unbroken line on the continent of Europe, where modernism never died, and you get much more experimental, bold, and at times slightly balmy architecture. And I'm going to show just a very few examples. This wonderful scheme, beautiful material and detailing, would have been a case study, but it was finished just a little bit too late for our book. But before we went to press, it won the Mies van der Rohe Award, which I think, correct me if I'm wrong, is perhaps one of the most prestigious on the continent. So here you've got deck access housing winning a very prestigious design award. Our continental case studies just have one spread, but you still get the data and the pictures and plan. And this example, Snabberhus, excuse my pronunciation, it says it already, the contrast between the UK and the continent. I mean, just look at that plan. It's kind of outrageous in its single-mindedness. As is this one, which is student housing, so students are different, which offers no privacy at all, but an absolutely beautiful experience of this, I think, ivy-clad deck. Here's an example of how you can take very simple, regular, rectangular repetitive blocks, but by doing wonderful theatrical things with the decks themselves, the attached decks, you create joy. This is Bordeaux, a complete big street of housing, which is completely covered over. So a very large atrium street with homes looking into it. And here in the Netherlands, probably of our continental examples, this is the one that could be in Britain, that looks most kind of British in its kind of, again, careful, restrained rationalism. But a really good example of how to make a complete urban block with deck access. And here, prefabrication and timber. So a lot of the continental schemes use timber, which I'm afraid is very hard to do, in fact, pretty much impossible above 4 stories in Britain. But here you can see that done in a very full-on way, a single material cladding and structure of the whole scheme. And this is a retrofit that's been widely published. You might know of a post-war building that's stripped back to its frame, reclad with decks and balconies all around. So my final bit is just to tell you, not to show you our practical guide, but to tell you what's in it. So basically, this should answer all of your practical, technical, regulatory questions about how to do deck access in Britain at the moment, because rules change. So I'm very grateful to my colleagues in what we call Knowledge Hub at Pollard Thomas Edwards, who were largely responsible for putting this together. So, for example, you get lots of very clear diagrams like this one that explain to you how the length and design of decks is limited by fire service access in the case of this diagram. You get an explanation of the environmental performance of deck access housing, including strategies for controlling ventilation and overheating. And there's a cost section contributed by Martin Arnold, Associates, Quantity Surveyors. And the headline from that is that, because we're quite often told by developer clients who are reluctant, I think for cultural reasons, to do deck access, that it's too expensive. The conclusion of this, which was an elemental cost study taking two different blocks of flats, on the left deck access, on the right a mansion block layout, exactly the same amount of net accommodation. What do they cost? They cost almost exactly the same. To be truthful, the deck access was about 2% more expensive. And also, to be truthful, that implies a fairly simple form of deck and enclosure. So some of the more elaborate ones, for example, recessed behind a separate brick facade, would add further cost. But it's not the kind of runaway difference in cost that some would have you believe. We have model layouts, different ways to do the circulation, flat types, and whole block configurations to help you design your very own deck access scheme. So good luck with that. I hope you will. And to help you do it, you might like to buy this book if you haven't already. You can download it. You can download it in sections, but I hope you'll buy an old-fashioned hard copy. Thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry if I've overrun, Scott, and I will stop there.
Andrew, I don't think you've overrun. I think you've done it perfectly in time. If you're able to stay for 10 minutes, it'd be great to take some questions. We've got quite a few in the chat. And Robert, I will just ask for the third poll to go up now. But essentially, I thought it was really inspiring seeing the different examples from the historic to the contemporary and also the continental, where they do change quite a bit. And you can see where we've become a bit more humanistic, I think, in our approach, which is quite nice. And there's quite a few nice comments from someone who said that their deck they used as a stage as a child to sing a Eurovision song and some memories. So it's quite interesting. Just a few questions from the chat. John Duffy asked about the defensible space. I'm sure it's in the book, probably may be more on the practical side, but how do you redefine the linear decks to give a sense of ownership to each of the fronting homes? I think some of the examples showed that, but it'd be great to get your view on that.
Yes, certainly. So I think the first point to make is that in the UK now, planning requirements, particularly in London, will mean that you're going to be limiting the number of homes on any particular level of deck, typically to 8. I think you can argue for more, but as a maximum. So already you've got a relatively small number, and hopefully you know your neighbours. It's not like the quarter-mile open decks that you saw at Lefevre Walk. The second point is how many neighbours are actually passing your home to get to their own home. So that depends on whether you put the stair in the middle or whether you have a stair at either end. But typically that's going to be 3 at most, sometimes less. And then you think about the detail of the deck. So some of the examples you saw pull the deck away from the facade of the building, so it becomes like a semi-detached structure, which then bridges across to the flat. You saw an extreme example in the officer's house, atrium one, but sometimes they can be pulled away just by a metre, say. So that gives you more privacy, and it also creates a private threshold zone in that bridge area, which is clear of the access zone, and therefore it seems to me quite legitimate to put plants on there, probably not barbecues. And then there are a whole set of other issues about the detailed design of windows and so on to create a sufficient sense of privacy within a typology that does, for which that is a challenge. More so, I suppose if you compare it to a house on a street, it comes down to the depth of your front garden, doesn't it? How you can recreate some of that sense of a front garden within a street in the sky.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. I know there's many more questions, and the next one I was going to go to was you, Jason Yates, who had a comment in the feed, but maybe I'll go to you as you've got your hand up. And maybe
thank you. Yeah, I hope you can hear me. No, I was just wondering, and I think you've just talked about a couple of those issues actually. Have you done any investigation on what makes good or bad deck access? For example, you talked about the length of the deck, whether or not there could be, the design of the windows, whether or not it's overlooked. I'm trying to think of other things like defensible space. Just like on a standard street, you'd need defensible space, wouldn't you? And I noticed quite a lot of the examples didn't. Is there anything in your experience that makes a good or a bad deck, and what are the factors?
I think I said quite a bit about the kind of physical design aspects of that, but the other key component is management. And with hindsight, we know that schemes that were condemned as failures in the post-war period, some of that failure was down to lack of active management. And I suppose your question also begs a really interesting and sensitive point around who most happily lives in deck access housing. And I guess the answer to that is I think you'd need to be open to a degree of friendliness towards your neighbours. If you're an intensely private person who wants to go home and shut the door and block out the world, deck access is possibly not for you. But on the other hand, you don't have to, you don't have to be forced into conviviality by living on a deck. It can provide you with sufficient privacy and the isolation you might crave.
Is defensible space about isolation, or is it about engagement with the street? You know, it's a medium, isn't it, between the two?
So I mean, that was it. I mean, we're talking Alice Coleman and all of that here, aren't we? It's a space that mediates between the public realm and the private. That's what a front garden gives you, and that's what a threshold can give you.
Exactly. So I suppose the issue may be that people are walking straight past your window if you don't have anything. I mean, it struck me that the more successful schemes you were talking about were ones which had actually the deck was actually separate from the front doors, pushed away.
Yeah, so those can work well, but again, they have to be really carefully detailed, because sometimes by pulling them away, you get a bird's eye view down into the flat below. So it is quite subtle what works and what doesn't. But also, without going into detail, it triggers a different approach to smoke control, and it adds a bit to the cost. Or you do wide decks, which are wide enough to have a continuous front garden in effect, as well as the street component. The issue there is you get a lot of overshadowing.
Great. Thank you very much. Just before going to Leslie, there was a question from Chris Dancer about deck access and how it performs less well than internal corridor blocks. And how do you tackle these issues, especially related to social housing? For example, the poor form factor, the wall to floor ratios, and I guess you cover the more costly to construct, I guess the perception of that.
Sorry, what was the first bit? Performs less well because...
Performs less well than an internal corridor block. You cover the cost aspect,
okay.
But then there's about form factor and wall to floor ratios.
Well, the form factor, actually deck access performs pretty well because it lends itself to very simple rectangular blocks. Of course, you can make any building as complicated as you need to, but okay, so just bear with me on this one, follow this. Given the push for dual aspect, whether you share it or not, it's there, and it's actually mandatory in the 21 London plan. You have to demonstrate why you can't do it. Now, it may not be 100% imposed at the moment, but just it is actually mandatory. Given that point, a simple rectangular deck access block gives you dual aspect. To achieve it in other typologies is increasingly difficult and is leading designers into very complex forms. For example, highly articulated blocks and towers, which try to get some measure of dual aspect by giving corner flats, for example, by having deep recesses. So it leads you in a direction which produces a very inefficient form factor. So I think it's actually extremely simplistic to say that corridor access performs better or lobby access. We're in a new world now of stringent and increasingly tight environmental regulation. It's making it really difficult to do all forms of housing, and contains lots of contradiction. So, Part O encourages wide frontage, shallow depth flats with natural ventilation, and kitchens on the outside wall, for example, which is adds a lot to cost in the bulk of the building. I probably said enough given the time, but read the book. There's more in there.
Very helpful. Leslie, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, just offered a slight tangent, but ultimately hugely relevant. I'm very focused at the moment on the National Planning Framework Scotland and the National Policy Planning Framework for the UK. And I'm very concerned that within both of those documents, the government setting local authorities targets to deliver houses, not homes, houses. And what's happening certainly around Edinburgh, where I am, and in other parts of Scotland, certainly, is the vast tracts of land have been developed by land banking developers with effectively very low density housing and villas. And we seem to have, in a city like Edinburgh, which is historically has a lot of high density living. I live in a tenement block, which works very well. I think there's huge room for coming back to the idea of higher density living, and you can provide for a wider demographic, because what's happening with the housing developers is they're just producing family villas. And in cities like Edinburgh, we've got away from that kind of dense living. And I would think that deck access could be a model which could come into its own, and instead of developing tracts of land outside Edinburgh and ending up with a commuter housing, is you could start to develop greater densities on the edges of cities. I just wonder what Andrew felt about that. So.
Thank you. I think you've put it very well. The examples I've been showing have mostly been in cities where, you know, higher density is taken as a sort of given. But as you rightly say, much of the UK's housing is very low density. Now, I'm a fan of houses and suburbs, I may say, and I think suburbs can be done in a sustainable way. But low-rise apartments could and should be part of that mix alongside houses. So, in a sense, well, okay, we did a little poll recently which suggested that, because I think there were only 50 respondents, so I'm not saying this is God-given truth. 75% of people living in apartments, and they're all in London in this case, saw themselves in 3 years' time or 5 years' time living in a house. They wanted to live in a house. Being in an apartment was a stage towards living in a house. Now, that opens up a whole lot of questions, I think, including why is that and why can't we build flats that people want to stay in? It's sometimes said that a deck access home is the next best thing to having a house with its own front door and front garden on the street. Now, there are all kinds of qualifications around that, and which I mentioned some, and book mentions others. But I mean, to reinforce what you've said, yes, I think that deck access mid-rise, 4, 6, maybe up to 7 stories, is a great way of boosting density and providing variety of housing typologies within what might otherwise be relatively low density areas, comprised predominantly of houses. And we can do houses really well in Britain. We know how to do it, but we don't always manage it.
The trouble is we use so much land, and it's very counter to the carbon targets that we're trying to meet in terms of commuting, whereas the higher densities would alleviate that to a large extent. I'd just like to finish on, when I came to Scotland as an Englishman, the idea of living in a tenement was something that was second to living in a house. But when you're living in a tenement block that really works really well from a community point of view, and it'll be the same with deck housing, but you have to rely on ownership rather than rental to make it work, then it works very, very well. And I feel that I do live in a house, in a home, rather than just in a detached house.
Thanks. There's probably one final question here. Leading from that to sociability, I'd like to ask Anna McMillan if she's still here.
I am here. Yes, I'm here, Scott.
The point that kind of closes off, because we started out about the sociability, and you had a question about it.
Yeah, I did have a question about it. It seemed like the social side of the decks has been a bit lost in the contemporary examples, at least the ones you've showed. But you mentioned, Andrew, that you've selected these cases out of a lot of cases. So I was interested in your reflection on that, on how can these decks capture again that social space qualities, and compare with, so I think of myself walking home to one of these versus walking along a series of individual privacy homes at the front of a typical terraced houses, when you just look on the side of the footpath and you can see how people have changed it and how they are so small spaces of each one of a bit of a human being that lives in the house. And some of these feel slightly cold, even if they're very architecturally, beautifully designed, but they sort of lack this dimension, I think. So my question goes to that.
It's a really interesting question. And I think perhaps it tells us something about how architects and architectural photographers still like to present their work devoid of life in all its pristine. If you look at the, there's Bourne Estate photographs, beautiful scheme, nobody there. That's not the case with all our case studies, but curiously, the ones I seem to have selected do display that. So although I've talked a lot about the social opportunity that a well-designed deck can offer, and I believe that is the case, perhaps haven't illustrated it very well. So thank you for pointing that out. But importantly, you talked about your journey home, I think, and that experience. But of course, part of that experience is the point where you open the communal front door into if you live in a block of flats rather than a house. And there's that journey from the communal front door to the private front door. What's it like? And certainly my experience of many corridor access schemes is pretty grim, actually. It's very... It doesn't create spaces that you want to linger in, or even that you feel very comfortable stopping to chat with people in. They're strictly, however badly or beautifully they may be designed or lavishly decorated, they still just feel like, a utilitarian way of getting from A to B. I don't know how many friendships have. Maybe we should have a poll. There isn't time now. How many people have made friends in the lift, lifelong friends in the lift lobby? Maybe a few, but normally we just want to avert our gaze and get to where we're going, don't we?
You might have more opportunity at a tower if the lift is really slow to get to it. Andrew, thank you very much for that enlightening presentation. I'm definitely gonna get that book. I think it's a great resource, so really looking forward to that. And thank you everyone for joining us and asking questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.